thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'll just give you a tiny bit of background about how we came to this webinar to begin with. I'll just say it was in May of this year, the Bay program released a report. It was a summary of a scientific and technical advisory committee's workshop. And it was called Rising Water Temperatures in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. So I'll put the link to this in the chat in a second. And so that was May, and then we had the hottest June, and then we had the hottest July. And as you know, as we kept breaking all these records, you know, the articles started pouring in from, you know, the bleaching of the coral reefs in Florida, and that this was a worldwide phenomenon. And we started asking ourselves, well, what does that mean for the aquatic life in the Bay, and what were the recommendations from that STAC report? So we've got two wonderful speakers tonight that are going to take us through this. I'll start with the first. So Seth is going to kick us off. So a little bit about Seth. So Seth Coffman is the Chesapeake Bay Project Manager of Trout Unlimited's Mid-Atlantic Cold Water Habitat Restoration Program. That was a mouthful, Seth. He's focused on the implementation of watershed scale restoration efforts in Virginia. Seth has responsibility for implementing stream and riparian corridor restoration in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. And day to day, he's responsible for landowner outreach and project management, including scheduling, budgeting, and reporting. He also coordinates the data collection and analysis, partner communication, and conservation practice implementation. He has a Master of Science in Biology from James Madison University and a Bachelor of Science in Fisheries Science from Virginia Tech. Yeah, as a Wahoo, I have to give you a hard time. So Seth has worked 18 years monitoring and restoring cold water fisheries, and has been working with Trout Unlimited for the last 14 years to implement and monitor watershed scale restoration efforts on public and private lands. And then I'll introduce Doug after Seth goes through his slides, okay? All right, so I'm going to stop sharing.
And Ian, just for housekeeping, and I see one participant has their hand up. Do you want to just give kind of ground rules for questions, how you want to handle that?
Yeah, thank you, Seth. So ideally, what we'd like to do is, Robert, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. As long as you can hear okay, and you'll be able to see the slides, and you'll see Seth's slides in just a second. Ideally, what we'd like to do is hold questions until, and just put your questions in the Q&A function. You can just, you know, hold your mouse over, well, this is Zoom, and I think everybody's been on a Zoom webinar, but if you just hold your mouse over where it says Q&A, you can just type your question in there, and then we'll get to all of them at the end of Seth's talk, and then we'll turn it over to Doug. He'll answer questions, and then Doug will finish with recommendations. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks. Take it away.
Well, thank you. Appreciate being here this evening with you all to talk a little bit about some brook trout conservation work in a warming climate. Doug's gonna get in more of the STAC report. I'm going to speak to some of the work that I do with Trout Unlimited, and our primary goal and focus is on brook trout conservation and restoration in Virginia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just the ecological needs of brook trout and how warming waters affect that, and some of the restoration work that we do with Trout Unlimited to mitigate against climate change. And to build up and create more resiliency in the watershed for cold water streams and species that depend on those cold water systems, and provide more thermal refugia for brook trout and cold water animals. So we'll talk about that. So first off, I work for Trout Unlimited. We're a national nonprofit organization dedicated to engaging with communities across America to repair our rivers and streams and other water bodies that we all depend on. You know, our mission is to bring together diverse interests to care for and recover rivers and streams so that our children can experience the joy of wild and native trout and salmon. And so in my work in Virginia and the East Coast, Chesapeake Bay watershed area, we are focused on brook trout, the only native salmonid to Virginia, where I am. And its historic range is from Maine up into Canada, down through the mid-Atlantic into the southern Appalachian Mountains. This is a map from about 2005 showing the kind of population status of brook trout in their native eastern range. Blue and green are good. Red and yellow are bad, meaning those populations are greatly reduced from where they should be, which means that in that sub-watershed where it's red, less than 50% of the habitat is occupied by brook trout. If you're green, more than 90% of the habitat's occupied. The blue is qualitative, meaning the best data we have or the best assumption from biologists is that brook trout still persist in those watersheds. And then the gray are watersheds that historically supported brook trout but have been extirpated from land use activities, degradation of habitat fragmentation, that sort of thing. And so coming out of 2005, this kind of told us as biologists and managers what we knew and what we didn't know. So efforts were started here to say, okay, what do we need to do to protect our best of the best, the blues? What do we need to do to learn more about, the greens? What do we need to do to learn more about the population in those blue categories where we just don't have updated data? And then what do we need to be doing to try to recover, support, and help those populations in those yellows and reds? This was all done at a 12-digit Huck watershed scale, so a sub-watershed scale. Think of where I am here in the Shenandoah Valley. The North Fork of the Shenandoah River has probably 10 or 12 Huck 12s within it. So these are a smaller drainage area and still a pretty big size to do management and conservation practices at. So as the data was more refined, we were able to dig down into the data sets and really get a better idea of where our brook trout are and where they are not. And so this is the newest data set that we have, which is patches of brook trout habitat, which are smaller than a Huck 12, but a little bit bigger than just one stream segment or one stream reach. And we started categorizing these by resilient and redundant populations. And so where you see larger intact patches of habitat like these large green ones or these large blue ones, those are populations that have enough occupied habitat, good population numbers, good genetics that those populations should be able to sustain in the future. Where you have some of these smaller gray populations, like here in the Shenandoah National Park, they could be more at risk of extirpation or population reduction from anthropogenic impacts, climate change, those sorts of things. And so with this data, we can then say, okay, we're getting a better idea. We're kind of getting data at a management scale where we can go in and do conservation practices to improve habitat and really measure and see some ecological lift, hopefully, in those populations. And we do all this through a climate change lens. And so I look at what are the impacts to brook trout, what limits their success. Well, it's really two things. It's too much sediment in the stream and the water temperature is too warm. Sediment comes from a variety of sources, and a lot of them play together with warmer temperatures. So too much sediment can clog up the bottom of the creek bed, which can then impact the macroinvertebrates that these fish need to eat. It can impact their spawning habitat. Brook trout spawn on pea-sized gravel. When that gravel gets covered up with a lot of silt and sand, the brook trout eggs cannot survive. They get smothered out. The other thing that happens with all that sediment is it can also cause warming of temperatures because it'll fill in a stream bed, make it shallower, and it's going to warm up more, particularly if there's no riparian buffer. And so excessive sediment's a big issue, and then extremely high summer water temperatures are a big issue. And so this graph just shows a stream where we did some work that I'll talk about more here in a little bit. But this black line is essentially the thermal threshold for brook trout as far as water temperature goes, with temperature in Celsius on the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis is exposure days. So as you move through a summer, a fish can handle a 1 day max daily temperature of maybe like 26, 27 degrees Celsius, but they can't handle 14, 21, 28 days of those temperatures. those max daily temperatures need to be lower over the extended period of time. And so I can go out to a stream, collect data over the course of a summer, plot it against this black line curve and see where I fall. If I fall on that line or above it, I know I'm probably too warm for this to be potential brook trout habitat. If I fall below the line or well below the line, then I know I have suitable water temperatures. If I'm somewhere around that line, I'm going to look at the stream and say, okay, are there management strategies that I can implement to improve that water temperature so that it could be suitable for brook trout? And so that's kind of one of the first data cuts I can look at from a water temperature perspective. So how do we get warm water? Well, ag practices. My old college professor, my advisor would say, when I was doing this in 2005, he didn't know of any populations of brook trout we had lost to climate change specifically. They tend to kind of get fragmented and diffuse away slowly, but we can pinpoint populations we've lost from land use practices, particularly ag practices. So denuded stream banks from livestock access, like this stream, create a lot of sediment, no shade. The stream gets wider, it gets shallower, it slows down, and that just means it heats up more over the course of a summer with a lot of solar insolation that it receives from sun during the summer. Again, eroding stream banks, no riparian buffer. When you have an eroding stream bank like this, you can see right here, these are tree tubes from a previous crep planting that they tried to get trees growing, but you put them on an unstable stream bank where that bank is migrating outside with that meander bend a couple feet a year, you end up with all your tree tubes in the channel. And so one of the strategies we look at is stream bank stability to create suitable conditions in the riparian area for trees to survive and grow. So we're not just kind of watching our money and our tree tubes wash down the stream. Again, livestock having access is a big issue. And so this is one of the main things we work with landowners and farmers in the Shenandoah Valley to work with them getting their livestock fenced out. And just to kind of make a high point of where the sediment comes from, and one of the things that the report talks about is to make sure we're implementing BMPs that don't create additional warm water surges into our waterways. So suspended sediment in a study that was done in Smith Creek in Rockingham County, Virginia, showed that almost over 70% of the sediment in the stream channel was coming from stream bank erosion. It wasn't from overland soil erosion, stream bank erosion. Now, this does not hold true throughout the entire bay. They did a similar study up in Lancaster County. A lot of that sediment was coming from upland sources, from fields and that sort of thing. So all these systems can be a little bit different, but the impacts that they have as far as degrading habitat and too much sediment kind of run the same throughout the watershed. So another impact, and this ties into climate change. As we look at climate change, it's not just about warmer water. It's about more stochastic events of storms. I'm here in the Shenandoah Valley. We're in a drought. Our local county board of supervisors are declaring drought disasters, trying to get some state relief, some funding. But just over the other night in Bath County, a drainage got 8 inches of rain last 2 nights ago. And so these massive downpours we see can have major impacts on habitat degradation, flooding, and erosion, particularly when you have these culverts at road stream crossings that are undersized. They can blow out a stream channel and create barriers to fish movement, which fragments habitat. Likewise, when we get in these drought conditions, if a fish doesn't have the ability to move and find what I say is that thermal refugia, so where are those groundwater upwellings so they can find some cool water to hang out until the rains come and it starts to flow again. Well, if there's a barrier there, they can't move into those areas. And if you're in a situation where a whole area above, a whole section of stream above a culvert or a road crossing like this goes dry, and then it re-wets after a year or two, and the fish can't move upstream to repopulate that area, well, then we've just lost a segment of our population in that watershed. And this is just a map to illustrate that a little bit of where you put a road through a watershed, you have these culverts. If they are not passable for fish, you can take what was once a totally connected population of brook trout and create 5 distinct populations of brook trout, which disrupts gene flow and repopulation after stochastic events. So what are the riparian practices that we look to implement? Oops, wrong one. We look to implement a lot of different riparian corridor restoration practices. So improve in-stream habitat with rock and wood cover, provide a passage for aquatic organisms, removing culverts, replacing them with bridges, taking out dams, stabilizing stream banks, planting riparian buffers on stable stream banks, and getting livestock out of the stream. And that's our bread and butter. That's what we look to do. Those things reduce sediment and provide the opportunity for a buffer to grow up so we can get that shade. The habitat improvement helps to take those wide, shallow channels and narrow them back down to a more conducive channel morphology so that they're deeper and they're narrower so they can maintain cold water better through the system than a wide, shallow stream can. So an example of some of these and where like just working in the headwaters is important. This is the very headwaters of the Jackson River in Highland County, Virginia. And we worked with a landowner to put in about 60,000 feet of exclusion fence on all the water features on his farm. And in this very headwaters, we planted a grass herbaceous pollinator buffer that you can see here from this aerial. These photos are actually courtesy of our partners with CBF working in Virginia. But this helps to maintain the cool water coming out of the springs that feed the Jackson River. Here's another picture of it where we put in our 35-foot buffer, and you can see the channel meandering through there. There are brook trout in this stream. At least there were last year. It's pretty dry right now, but the brook trout do have the opportunity to move up and down this system. There's a picture of the pollinator habitat, kind of from ground level looking in there. So what do we know about brook trout and water temperature? Well, they need to be in water below 23 degrees Celsius. They prefer below 20, more like around 16 or 17. A lot of work has been done over the past 2 decades looking at climate change impacts to brook trout. A study done by Fink when he was in grad school at JMU in 2007, he did an experimental shading study to look at, can I drop the water temperature if I have canopy closure, knowing that it takes 15, 20 years to get a riparian buffer to grow up. What if we accelerate that process with some artificial shading? And what he found was that he did see the max daily temperatures drop 1.4 degrees Celsius. And then by maintaining an 80% canopy cover shade, he could offset in this system a 2.2 degrees Celsius increase in mean air temperature. So not that you would drop the stream temperature, but with an 80% canopy cover, you can mitigate against and kind of hold baseline if you saw a 2.2 degree increase. So we know riparian buffers work. We also know brook trout will change their behavior as temperatures warm. They're going to seek out thermal refugia, just hunker down for the most case and just try to make it through until the rains come again and it cools off. We know that that can be even more impacted when they're in a system with non-native salmonids like brook trout or like brown trout or rainbow trout, which have a tendency to outcompete them for some of those good thermal refugia locations. The other thing we know is that not every brook trout stream is the same. Elevation, aspect, hill shade, hyporheic zone exchange, which is the subsurface flow of shallow groundwater with the surface flow and groundwater influence, really impact how a stream's water temperature interacts with increasing air temperatures. I'm going to get into that a little bit more. So some of the very early studies that were done looking at the impacts of climate change on brook trout were kind of doom and gloom and really overly pessimistic because they were done at a broader scale, looking at more riverine system habitat and not these small headwater streams. And so they assumed very high levels of sensitivity to increasing air temperatures, but they didn't really account for some of the things that smaller streams have in these microclimatic conditions, like I mentioned, of elevation, hill shade. Some of these are in very deep hollows, and the sun doesn't hit them 12 hours a day. Some of them have a lot of spring influence and groundwater influence, which help to buffer against increasing air temperatures. And so coming out of some of that work in the early 2000s, USGS and TU and other partners started looking at more specific stream reaches and smaller watersheds to see what are we really seeing in these brook trout systems. And so coming off the heels of a study that USGS did, it was Snyder and Than Hitt out of the Leetown Science Center in the Shenandoah National Park, where they put paired air water temperature loggers in many of the streams in the Shenandoah National Park. And they found that not every stream was the same, which is what we kind of hypothesized. that you see differences from streams at one end of the park to the other. But not only that, you see differences within streams. So the very head of a stream has a different sensitivity to air temperature than the middle section or the lower section. And that is due to the different influences of groundwater at different locations through those stream systems. So we said, hey, we should take a look at this in some of our systems in the Shenandoah Valley. So we got together with Than and Jacob Lemon, who is our science coordinator for TU, and we enlisted the volunteers in our TU chapters and deployed about 60 or 70 temperature loggers across 5 drainages in the Shenandoah Valley, and spaced out at 1 kilometer apart. And we collected water temperature over the course of a summer, and then we ran it through Than Hitt's modeling to look at what would the water temperature be, and would the habitat water temperature be suitable for brook trout under a 1.5 degrees Celsius climate increase, a 3 degree, and a 5 degree, and how does it vary within each of these drainages? And so, like I mentioned, what we found was, not every stream is as sensitive to increasing air temperature as the other one. You have low sensitivity, where there's a weak correspondence between air and stream temperatures, due mostly probably to groundwater and spring influence. Intermediate, where you see a dampened correspondence between air and stream temperatures. And then you have high sensitivity, where water temperature tracks really closely to the fluctuations over the course of a day in a summer for air temperature. And it's this type of data that can inform us of, one, where do we have the opportunity for thermal refugia for brook trout and other cold water species? And then the second thing I ask is, can those fish get to those cold water areas during those dry, hot summer times? And if they can't, how can we make sure they can? So an example of what we found, and this website here in the top is a mapper where you can go check out this data that's hosted by USGS, and you can run it through the different air temperature scenarios here, 1, 0.5, 3, and 5. And you see the dots are corresponding with different colors for kind of the maximum weekly average temperature, which is the metric that Than was looking at with this study. And so you have this for all those watersheds we did. And what's interesting here is up in the headwaters of this is Dry River, you have 3 really cold locations. And then we came down and we hit this hot patch right here in the middle. And then we got down below and it cooled down a little bit. It cooled down, it warms up, it cools down, it warms up, as you see the different color gradients there. And this is where Than talks about how you don't have a uniform response to air temperature increases across your stream. And this is where you can start to get thermal fragmentation of habitat. If you have long stretches of warm water, a fish may not want to move through that water to get to where there is cold water if they don't know. And so how do we accelerate or how do we expand the opportunity to move to those waters, or what is there a habitat or a management strategy that we can implement to take this little red hotspot to more of a light blue so a fish feels more welcome to move through there? This is just zooming in on this particular data point on Beaver Creek. And this just shows when you click on a point in this mapper, you will see the different scenarios. So across the top here, you have sensitivity to groundwater. And then running down, you have the different climate change scenarios of 1.5, 3, and 2. And you see what this site was modeled at for those temperatures. And again, remember that 22, 23 is kind of our break point for brook trout. So this site's going to be getting too warm under that 5 degree increase, even the 3 degree increase. And so what's supposed to happen in this mapper, which it wasn't working earlier, and I may have to get a hold of Than, is when you change the little flipper up here for these different models, the color should change in your dots and show which spots would be unsuitable for brook trout under that climate scenario. And so what typically happens is, as you're going from 1.5 to 3 to 5, you'll see those dots turn from blue to red. And that means that those spots are getting too warm for brook trout. So real quick, I'm going to finish with a project we did and some real world data that was done to improve habitat because it was impacted by ag, but we also got some climate change resiliency built into this system too. So this is Beaver Creek in Rockingham County, a spring-fed freestone stream. had cattle, livestock grazing it, was overly wide. You can see that's one of our TU volunteers there, and was shallow and was too warm. It was terrible fishing. We did a restoration project to narrow the channel back down, deepen it, build in some riffles, and then provide the opportunity to plant a riparian buffer. So this was in 2011. This was 1 year after we did that project. We re-meandered the channel and gave it some bends. This is what it looked like near that same site at 2017. So this was 7 years after we did the project. And I don't have a picture for right now, but I was out there the other day. We have basically complete canopy closure out there now in 2023, where it's been 13 years since we did this project. Another site here, overly wide, cattle were in here all the time. Check out this tree right here, and the big tree in the corner is kind of a reference point. We re-meandered this channel. There's that same tree. We re-meandered this channel, took it from about 70 feet wide down to about 25, made it deeper, swifter, maintains the spring water influence coming in so the water stayed colder. And we started getting riparian buffer growing up. We planted willows, river birch, eastern cottonwoods, and pin oak, a variety of tree species in here. And it's just been growing like crazy. And we, like I said, we have canopy closure now. We got 25, 30-foot trees on this site. It's been pretty remarkable. Here's an area that was just wide open grazed. We let this just naturally recolonize with some sycamores, walnut trees, briars and brambles came up, and it's gone through its succession. And now we have a complete forest canopy there. And here's that same temperature data I talked about. So the red line is pre-restoration temperature data I collected. See, we're right on that black thermal threshold. The other two lines are post-restoration data that we collected. So just by, and this was before the riparian canopy cover was even grown up, just by narrowing and deepening the channel and providing an opportunity for that cold spring water that comes into Beaver Creek to stay cold, we've dropped those water temperatures dramatically and improved the habitat. We also improved the stream bed substrate. It went from a very fine, silty stream to more coarse. So this dotted line was our pre-restoration data, which shows that well over 50% of our substrate was smaller than gravel. So that silt sand that chokes out habitat for macroinvertebrates. And then we moved, as we went through the project after 2 years, we moved to where we're mirroring more of our reference reach curve for our stream bed substrate, where about half of our sample is in that small to medium gravel size, which is good for macroinvertebrates. It's good for the cycling of nutrients in the stream channel. And we saw brook trout, our ultimate test here. We saw young of year brook trout. We saw adult brook trout moving into the system from nearby streams, because fish naturally want to move. There's exploratory tendencies in them. And when they move out, if they can find good habitat, they'll hang out in it. Another great brook trout. But there's my connection to the bay. We also have American eels up in these spring creeks in the Shenandoah Valley. Big females for the most part. So these are very important systems, not just for native local freshwater fish, but also for anadromous, catadromous species. And the eels, in this case, they move all the way up out of the bay from the Atlantic Ocean, spend several years up here, and then out migrate again to spawn in the Sargasso Sea. These are critical systems for some of those larger, more fecund females up there. And so we're benefiting them as well. So finish real quick. I mean, what's stuff that we can do? We were chatting a little bit earlier with Ann, and kind of like, where do you guys go from here with some of this data? Well, I mean, one thing you can do, you can find some volunteer conservation events. We have many TU chapters in Virginia. There's many throughout the Mid-Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Pennsylvania has them everywhere. They do riparian tree plantings. We do stream cleanups. We do outreach events with youth. Get involved, like many of you probably do, with Chesapeake Bay Foundation tree plantings. Riparian buffers are #1 key to try to provide that shade to keep water temperatures cool. Master Naturalist events, I've had a lot of success working with them. You have very inquisitive, intuitive people who are looking to get involved. Check out your local waters. If you do a local walk, take a thermometer with you. If you do a regular walk every evening, every other evening, start taking a little bit of data and just checking your water temperatures. If you're doing it at the same time every day or every other day, you can start to build a data set and see what you have if you are seeing increasing in temperatures. And then there's always a role for us in advocacy, advocating for conservation funding at state level, getting involved in your local county or town or city governments to help implement conservation practices that can improve shade, improve riparian canopy cover, to improve waterways. And that's what I got. I went a little bit long, so I apologize there. Couple minutes long.
You did great, Seth. Thank you. All right. So what's a BMP?
Okay, BMP, best management practice. So when I talk conservation practices or management strategies or BMPs, those are best management practices. And so a lot of different industries have them. In my world, I'm talking about agriculture best management practices. So those can be the fencing livestock out of streams, planting trees along the stream corridor. No-till is another great conservation ag BMP. We do in-stream habitat work. That's a conservation BMP. And you'll see forestry BMPs, which have to do with maintaining proper erosion control practices associated when there's a timber harvest. So the skidding area, the roads, those sorts of things all have recommended or mandated BMPs with them.
So we've got some questions. So I'll run through this quickly. So Tom McKee wants to know, how do you narrow and deepen a channel?
Yeah, great question. So that is done. We have a stream restoration specialist on staff. He's an engineer. You don't have to be an engineer to do this, but he is an engineer. And it's done. It's a lot of science and a little bit of artwork technique to make it fishy. But really what we're trying to do, we'll go out and find a stream in the watershed or a section of stream on the stream we're working on that is intact or in a natural state and condition, meaning it has the proper channel profile, geometry, and shape. And we will measure that and then use that to design the repair for the impacted section. So if a stream is overly wide, how do I know it needs to be 25 feet wide instead of 70? Well, we go and look at sections that are undisturbed, and we use that as our model to build and design off of. And then the work is done with excavators with a bucket and usually articulated thumb, so they can pick up rocks and logs and place them where we want them. We use skid steers for moving stuff around, but most of the channel work is usually done with an excavator.
So quick follow-up question on that. Molly asked, how did the stream change from silt to gravel? Did you have to add, substrate? So
it's a great question. So if you imagine a stream is a conveyor belt. Its job is to move water and sediment downstream. And if it gets too wide, there's energy loss in that width. And so it doesn't have the energy to move the sediment downstream. And so the fine sediment will fall out of suspension and clog up the stream bed. When you narrow it back down, it keeps those finer sediments moving. Now, part of the narrowing down also, we reconnect the stream to the floodplain. And so when a storm happens, the water rises up, it's muddy and filled with silt. The heavier particles fall out first and stay in the stream channel. Those would be the gravel, the cobble stuff. And then the finer particles are lifted and they are spread out over the floodplain. And as that water slows down the floodplain, those sediments fall out. And those sediments are usually heavily laden with nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen. Well, they're replenishing the floodplain, providing nutrients for our riparian buffers to grow up. And so it's a matter of creating the conditions so that conveyor belt can act properly. If you think about a mountain stream, you've been up in the mountains, that's where you see your big boulders and your big stuff, like, car-sized stuff. And you move down farther in a watershed, the particle size tends to get smaller and you see smaller particles. And so a mountain stream is going to dissipate its energy because it has a lot of gradient fall by going up and down as it drops. And the valley floor systems, because they're flat, they don't go up and down. There's no gradient, so they meander. And so we build meanders to help dissipate energy across a field or a floodplain. And then obviously having that connection to the floodplain is important to get that sediment deposit where it needs to be so it's not left in the channel.
Okay. Yeah, I got 7 and 5. Well, so just Katie says she's with Elizabeth River Project, and she said that they have volunteer opportunities to build riparian buffers in Hampton Roads. So thank you for that, Katie. Let's see. Mike would like to know, what's a huck?
Oh, Huck. So Huck is a hydrologic unit code. It's a nerdy way we talk about watersheds. It's basically a watershed, and so like there's different code numbers. So a Huck 8 is a really big watershed. A Huck 12 is a little smaller. A Huck 14 is smaller than that. So a Huck 8, and Doug can probably help me here. I think like the South Fork of the Shenandoah River is a Huck 8. So the whole drainage area of the South Fork of the Shenandoah River is a Huck 8. And there will be a dozen or more Huck 12s that make up that Huck 8 to try to put it to scale.
Yeah.
And I can try to answer other questions in the chat if folks are there, so we can keep going on. Just type them in if that works for folks too.
Yeah. Yeah, while we do that, we've got 4 in here, and then we'll turn it over to Doug right now. So let me just let's tell you a little bit about Doug. Thank you, Doug. You've been really patient. I appreciate it. So Doug's our Maryland senior scientist for CBF, and he's been with us since 2013. He's got a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from Millersville University in Pennsylvania, and a Master of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Houston, Clear Lake in Texas. He has spent his career in diverse fields and locations such as fisheries and marine mammal biology in the Bering Sea, environmental education and coastal resource management on the Texas Gulf Coast, and wetlands policy and coastal habitat restoration in the Puget Sound, forage fish species, salmon, and endangered southern resident orcas. Since coming to CBF, Doug reviews and advises on policies affecting the health of the Chesapeake Bay's waters and species, especially from the agriculture, urban stormwater, and navigational dredging sectors. So, Doug, I'm going to let you take it away. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ann. Hello, everybody. I am going to share my screen here. Hopefully this works well. Everybody see that?
Not yet.
It says I'm sharing my screen. Do you see it? You don't see it.
Just now we see it.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, or STAC, workshop on rising temperatures. And that workshop was brought together by the Chesapeake Bay program to look at the science. Just imagine that you had hundreds of the kinds of studies that Seth was talking about, and you could put that information together. There's a couple things that I think were observations that across the board scientists were noticing. Water temperatures were increasing, both in the Bay watershed streams and in the tidal waters, and that all the things we see in looking at trends is that is expected to continue. Water temperatures have ecological implications for the Bay and its watershed, and that there's probably a need to take a look at the Chesapeake Bay Partnership goals and see if they're in need of any kind of amendment because of what we're learning about temperature. And then there's kind of a critical need for insights into the partnership activities and whether or not we need to change any of the Bay cleanup goals. Look at any of the policies that might need to be changed, mitigate and adapt for the future. So I think it was really good observations made by lots of people that brought together the idea of the workshop. Why should we care about the temperature impacts? Well, at the very least, warm water doesn't hold as much dissolved oxygen. And so any of you that have been involved with the Bay cleanup for the last 30 some years, it's all about dissolved oxygen. It's all about reducing the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment loads that lead to plankton blooms, that lead to dissolved oxygen problems as those cells decompose on the bottom. So all of that just gets worse when you have warmer water. Warmer water is also shifting species distributions. Most things are going either north or deeper. So here's what the Rising Water Temperatures Workshop did. It took a bunch of the Bay Program staff, and they dug into both watershed and tidal waters science to basically look at hundreds of studies and what it's saying. Summarize those major findings about ecological impacts of rising water temperatures and develop recommendations on how to mitigate these impacts through the existing management instruments, or in some cases, finding out we need new ones. So this is what the analysis looked like for the watershed. So 5, 6, 7 different synthesis papers that looked at lots and lots of different studies across the watershed, and sometimes from outside the watershed to narrow down what the big mechanisms were. And then the same thing was done for the tidal sections, 6 papers here, synthesizing lots of different information about the bay and its temperatures and changes. So what are some of those influences? Air temperature is the main driver of influencing the bay water temperatures year round, right? So it's warmer in summer, the bay warms up, gets cooler in the winter, and it cools down. River temperatures, however, produce very little warming to the Chesapeake Bay's main stem. That was an important finding because one just assumed that all the hot water coming off of the rivers was affecting the bay, but really it's the ocean and the seasonal temperature variations that affect the bay's temperature mostly. And then increasing water temperatures will have a couple things in the bay. It will increase the volume of the dissolved oxygen dead zone, that area that has low dissolved oxygen. And there's a couple of things that are happening together. Nothing happens all from one specific cause and effect. Oxygen solubility, which is this idea of warmer water doesn't hold as much. Biological processes tend to speed up when the water warms up, especially in cold-blooded animals. So they're going to use up oxygen more quickly. And then stratification is this idea that the water warms at the surface, but stays cooler below. And there's like a layer that separates those. So you have all the dissolved oxygen being consumed by bacteria as they're decomposing things on the bottom, and it's not mixing with the well oxygenated surface waters. And so that stratification creates that dead zone at depth in the bay. So I'm going to come back to each of these maps a little later. The one on the right is showing temperature changes, kind of a trend over a 30-year period or so across the watershed, and then that same 30-year period or so in the bay. There's some interesting patterns to what we're seeing. I think some of the linkages that are happening from the ocean and the circulation in the ocean become apparent in the left figure, and on the right figure, it shows that we have the blue dots, the cooler places where it's actually gone down in temperature is where we've had really good forest cover, good weather, everything happening in all the right ways. A lot of regrowth of forest cover in some places where it was prior to the first data collection increasing, higher temperatures that came down. So let's look into the watershed impacts and recommendations. We're going to separate the impacts from the recommendations. We'll talk about those last. The impacts came from a synthesis of those papers that you saw. There were the workshop that was brought together. I participated in it. And also so did Chris Moore from Ann's office to be able to have one of us on each of the 2 breakout groups, the watershed group and the tidal waters group. There's a lot of science presented to us in the first day, and we came back for a second day to discuss that science and to come up with recommendations. So let's look at this map a little bit. You actually see some areas where the temperature went down as much as 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of the period. Most of those are in upstate Pennsylvania, a little bit in New York. Places where it got the warmest in the watershed is understandably along the I-95 corridor and our agricultural areas of the watershed. Across the watershed, stream temperatures increased from the whole time period, 1960 to 2014. Climate has the strongest influence on stream temperature, which means just as the waters are warming because of the air warming across the board. water temperatures are increasing more quickly than air temperatures in agricultural areas. And I think Seth's presentation showed that, where you have missing trees, cows in the streams, wide banks, all those kinds of things. Those areas are showing really large temperature increases. Water temperature increases are slower in forested sites, but they're still occurring, right? They're often influenced by dams, and dams are going to hold back water, make for wider channels. You'll have some parts of those will be warmer at the head, way upstream from the dams, and then near the dams themselves, it's actually colder, especially along the bottom. So if a dam is releasing into a stream below, it's going to be fairly cold right there and warm up later on as it runs down. And increases in water temperature occur at the greatest rates at the southern part of the range, which is not too unpredictable because it's right by the ocean. In the ecological impacts, strongest negative impacts are on cold water species, just like you heard Seth talk about with the brook trout, and where streams are near groundwater, and that groundwater would get cut off for some reason. Watershed wide, the warm water aquatic species are more tolerant, but they're seeing some of the larger increases. And so there's things like invasive species and pathogens that are affecting them as a mechanism. And then there's a lot more we don't know about things like algae, biofilms, zooplankton, macroinvertebrates, freshwater mussels, and the host species that are required to move those mussels up and down. So there's a lot of stream ecology that we're missing, and we're missing it at certain scales. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So the heat island effect, a lot of folks have been hearing a lot about that this year as we had extreme heat in these heat domes that are forming in the middle of the country that might slide east or west for a bit. Some pretty shocking statistics that a 10% increase, 10% Celsius increase in stream temperature in less than 15 minutes has been documented. And this is looking at 100 different East Coast streams that were sampled. So that's some of the synthesis information. Brown trout, which is an introduced trout, but it's very popular for recreational fishing. Mortality tends to happen to brown trout once it gets above 7 degrees Celsius. The benthic invertebrates, the things that the trout are eating, are decreasing in total abundance and diversity with increased temperatures, especially after these hot flash events. And then there's a general decrease over time in aquatic indices, things like the benthic index of biotic integrity, which most of the state agencies use to grade the streams for how well they're doing biologically. And what happens is there are sensitive species which cannot handle extreme temperature fluctuations, and then they're more tolerant species. So less of the sensitive species and more of the tolerant species. And this is after even just one of these events, but then if you have successive events, it gets worse. Temperature sensitivity is as Seth mentioned, it's kind of tricky. You need to get down to fairly small stream segments. So the Huck 12s that he mentioned are really where we're starting to see both big changes in temperature as well as the most resilience. As he mentioned, if they're small enough areas that are well shaded and have spring-fed conditions. The sensitive species in the watershed live in these small, shallow streams. And so if we don't have monitoring data at that scale, we may miss what's going on. And we're making broad generalizations about temperature and its effects without really having data at the right scale. And then we need to have models of that same finer scale to be able to look at how temperature sensitive species might be affected in future temperature regimes. All right, I'm going to move on to the tidal impacts and take a look at those because they're quite different. Temperatures are increasing across the Chesapeake Bay since 1960 at about 0.7 degrees Celsius per year. Pretty strong signal. The summer temperatures have increased more drastically than the winter ones, but it's kind of scary to think that the temperatures in the winter are also increasing. Just anecdotally, I grew up on the Susquehanna River in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and it used to freeze every single year 3 feet thick. I moved here back from the Pacific Northwest in 2013, and it froze that year and not any year since. So we are seeing some pretty big temperature fluctuations that are preventing freezing. And when that happens, there's some really different changes happening biologically. Okay, let's look at this one. We have decreases almost nowhere. I think there's one little tidal station down there on the Virginia, North Carolina border that decreased by 2.5 degrees C, and I'm not sure why. Somebody who knows that area could probably offer an explanation. That's pretty cool. Otherwise, it's been pretty much inching up, and inching up pretty big, because those 1 to 2.5 degrees Celsius dark red arrows are kind of everywhere. And then some of the places where you see the ovals, there's just not enough information yet, not enough data points to be able to say what's happening there. And so the team did not feel like they needed to project a trend in those water temperatures. So in the tidal areas, impacts are increasing temperature, biological processes I mentioned before. Everything has to breathe more heavily. If there's a lot of temperature in the water, dissolved oxygen goes down, so they have to breathe more heavily. Mineralization rates, that's how the things like dissolving chemicals, dissolving particles in the water, salinity, all those kinds of things. The alkalinity, that's all affected by temperature. And then the stratification that I mentioned before. Rising temperatures will increase hypoxic water volume due to dissolved oxygen solubility, increased biological activity, and increased stratification. Said all that before, but that is really the upshot of what the Bay Program tidal group was concerned about. Now, we've probably heard reports about the dead zone growing and shrinking over time, and how effective that is based on how much rainfall we get in the spring. That is truly still the bigger issue, is that springtime delivery of nutrients and sediments to the bay tends to determine how much dissolved oxygen problem we're going to have later, probably 2 or 3 months later. But over the course of many years, with warmer temperatures holding less oxygen and more stratification, the same amount of nutrients delivered to the bay under warmer conditions will have a bigger effect. And so all of our bay cleanup goals for how much nitrogen or phosphorus we reduce might have to be adjusted to account for that. Here's what they're the issue with suitability for species is quite complex in the tidal waters. In some cases, vulnerable species like striped bass and eelgrass have multiple stressors, not just the heat, but overfishing. There's sedimentation, the nutrient delivery itself, which creates the phytoplankton blooms, shades the eelgrass, and so that's one of the issues that I think is going to be a problem. Eelgrass is kind of at the southern part of its range anyway in the Chesapeake, and so just a little bit more temperature is really putting it at risk. And then the second biological effect in the bay is usually the shifts in species range and habitat. So again, they could go further north, maybe even out of the bay itself, and in other cases they're going to go to deeper water where they're just not known as much. Eelgrass is probably one of the biggest concerns. Without drastic improvements in water clarity, we could lose some of the viable populations of eelgrass. They could be extirpated in the bay. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and their annual surveys of bay grasses, where some of the beds that the eelgrass beds that they thought had disappeared over the last couple of years actually just went deeper, and so we can't see them from the aerial photographs, and so they were logged as losses, but instead they were probably just shifting their location to deeper where the water is a little bit cooler. So this is one where the science program of the Bay program may need to shift how they look for seagrasses and how they count up those acres in order to look at the Bay program progress and success. And then again, multiple stressors, hardening of shorelines like bulkheads and riprap. And I should have put my usual parenthetical in here in response to perceived shoreline erosion, because in a lot of cases, people take a look at one storm's erosion on their beach and decide, oh my gosh, I got to do something. And then they build a bulkhead or riprap, and a lot of that sand might come back later. But damage is done once the bulkhead or the riprap's put in there. So that tends to really affect fish community habitats, especially in the shallow intertidal waters. And that's usually where the submerged aquatic vegetation starts to grow right after that. So if you're going to kind of shorten the distance between uplands and where the SAV bed, the seagrass bed is going to grow, that's going to impact, it's going to shift that further offshore, maybe to deeper water where it can't get enough light. And so that then affects waterfowl and water quality. Waterfowl are feeding on those things. Water quality is dependent on the ability for the grasses to absorb a lot of the nitrogen that is in the water. So when we're talking about multiple interacting effects, the temperature is just one more stressor to stuff that's already happening out there. All right, I'm going to stop, take any questions you might have, and then we can look at recommendations for the report and the workshop after that.
We've got one so far. It's what species can better tolerate warming and which ones cannot?
Wine?
No, which species can better tolerate warming and which ones
Warming.
cannot?
I thought you said wine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Warming.
My mind's on wine too. I know what
Yeah, I know. It's about that time. So, we heard about salmonids, things like trout in the freshwaters. There's some sculpins that are these little kind of really armored fish. They're not very big. They're about like that. And there's not a lot of research on those, but they happen to be some of the host fish for the freshwater mussels. And some of those freshwater mussels are threatened or endangered. So the mussels themselves don't necessarily have a sensitivity to warmer water that we know of, but the host fish that deliver them up and down the streams are certainly affected. And then of course the biological community that everything feeds on. So we may not see like acute conditions in some of the streams. We might just see chronic conditions where over time the biological community becomes less diverse because the sensitive species are going to bail out, and what's going to be left is the tolerant stuff. In the bay, most things are tolerant. Oysters are, they're a little bit exposed to water temperatures that are really high, especially in the southern part of the bay where they're growing intertidally, and you have very warm surface waters. Less so in Maryland where they tend to grow deeper. The striped bass are having these really strange effects where the stratification affects them. So there's not enough dissolved oxygen at depth, so they come shallow. And when they go shallow, then they're in warmer water, which they also don't prefer. So they're trying to find a depth where they're not stressed. When they are temperature stressed, then they tend to be susceptible to certain diseases. And then there's also stress from catch and release fisheries. So again, generally nothing happens all at once, cause and effect from one of these things. It's a lot of the stuff we're already doing. And then you add temperature on top of it, and that's the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah, one more stressor. Yeah, it's funny that Steve put this. So Steve Matthews asked, recently a manatee was spotted in the Rappahannock. In fact, one was saved today. I don't know if you saw that. Yeah, it was in a pound net, and they were able to get the to get BMRC to come and get the person to lift the pound net, and they released the manatee, but it was stuck in the pound net. So,
and the Chesapeake's location in the middle of the mid-Atlantic is one of those things where we have warm weather stuff from Florida come up every summer, sometimes way up the bay. And in the winter, we have cold weather stuff coming down from New England. And so that noise in the system makes it really hard to know, what's the effect on species distributions, because it may be we have all the same species we had before, but certain species are spending more or less time in the bay over time. And so we have to think about how does that affect things like predator-prey relationships and all of the fisheries quotas that we set, based on 50 years of past data. Well, maybe something is coming to eat the crabs that wasn't here before. I do know that we start seeing in Virginia the Penaeid shrimp, the pink, brown, white shrimp coming up from the south, and even considering having a new fishery for them there. Well, the other thing that comes up with them is red drum, and red drum love crunchy things that are chewy in the middle. And so if there's no shrimp available further up the bay, and the redfish are coming further up the bay into Maryland, they're going to eat the crabs. And so those are the kind of the things. It's like we don't know how shifts in those predator-prey relationships are going to affect populations of things. And so some of the recommendations you'll see at the end are going to try to deal with that more of an ecosystem approach to fisheries management and not the single species like we've always done it.
So, I mean, just to answer Steve's question, I think we've seen manatees in the bay pretty much every summer, right?
Right.
But we're also seeing more dolphins, right? Just in general. Okay. All right. So a question, Margaret says, I keep imagining scattering some solar powered or wind powered fountains to mix the waters. Would that make any sense?
So we get, I would say, every time the Chesapeake Bay Foundation puts out information about dissolved oxygen in the bay, we get 20 or 30 phone calls from people who have better mousetrap ideas, some kind of machine that bubbles oxygen into the water. It would be a huge undertaking to make one milligram per liter difference in the dissolved oxygen at the bottom of the bay through any kind of engineered fix. This is a very large system responding to very large inputs over huge amounts of time. We are seeing that the cleanup is working. We've reduced the loads of nitrogen and phosphorus by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds, while we're adding hundreds of thousands of, actually millions of people, tens of millions of people to the watershed. So the cleanup does work. The reduction of those loads does affect the phytoplankton community that's creating the dissolved oxygen problem. And we have to keep working with those natural solutions. The whole idea for the bay cleanup is this terrible acronym called TMDL, total maximum daily load. And it's basically the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that can be delivered to the bay without causing dissolved oxygen problems. So that is a scientifically deduced number, and we have to get down to that number in order to get the fish to breathe every day. And so I'm actually involved with the Maryland office trying to put together some litigation memos and things like that, where I bring up, gee, we're setting permit limits for average annual concentrations of nitrogen, but last I heard, fish breathe every single day. And so we really need to take a look at being able to meet our water quality standards 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And that's going to require us to push the system back to where it can absorb the nutrients that it's going. But I appreciate the thought. Like I said, I get lots of better mousetrap ideas, but just the scale of what you'd have to do to make any difference in dissolved oxygen. Plus, I don't like using those engineering fixes because we should be, abiding by the Clean Water Act, which requires us to meet water quality standards 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And if we were able to just buy a machine and float it out there, I have a feeling we would put even more pollution into the bay.
I thought we were going to get through an entire webinar without saying TMDL, but man, somewhere somebody lost a bet on that. Let's see, Norm asked whether or not the maps that depict the temp change trends, are they from the stack report? I think the answer to that
Yes,
is
they are. Yeah, actually, it's the front cover of the stack report is those two maps. Yeah.
Okay. Charles says, we're missing our croakers. What's happened to them?
No idea.
So Charles, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll get our fisheries scientist, Chris Moore, to answer that question.
Yeah, and again, these trends in predator-prey relationships, croakers is one of those things that it's like nobody does like fishery-specific data collection on the population of croakers. We have like young of the year information on dozens of different species of fish from seining studies that are all designed to look at the effects of reproduction on striped bass, because it's the most popular fishery. But we don't take the rest of that data that is already in that data set and do models of the populations of all the other species that are caught, including models about who eats them, who are they eating, so that we can get some idea. Again, this is a recommendation of the report I'll get to in a second, is we need more ecosystem-based management of fisheries, including the ones that are not the most popular things to catch.
Okay, we'll do last question, then we'll go to the recommendations. So John Roberts would like to know, what is the impact of recreational boating on bay temps, considering that motorized vessels take suction from and discharge to surrounding water to cool their propulsion?
Yeah, again, I think it's a really, really small impact, probably not measurable compared to the other things. Just think about the solar radiation that's hitting the bay across, miles and miles and miles. Basically, even whatever we do in the rivers, the report is saying has no effect on bay temperature. It's whatever the ocean's doing, that's going to affect the bay temperature. It's getting into shallow waters. The sun is heating it up. That's really affecting the bay temperature over time. Any other, even a nuclear power plant, when you get 5 miles away from it, is not going to even be detectable, and they heat up the water quite a bit.
So, all right, I'll let you get to the recommendations. I have one question, but we'll get to that later. All righty. You want to present your recommendations?
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So there's lots. I'm not going to read all of them, but there's some big categories that I think are important, and stuff we may not have thought about. But we had really good discussion in these work groups to say, well, sometimes it starts at what's your land use? What did you zone this land for? We know that land use planning decisions happen at the local level, and a lot of the regulations that we have for managing natural resources, whether it be forests or water quality, are state permits. In Maryland, we do have a Forest Conservation Act, which allows for local management of forest through land use codes. And we had to put a lot of work at CBF into improving that because of, I would say, bad behavior by the local governments in how they were abusing that state law. But making good land use decisions, especially in how we conserve existing forested lands, is super important to protecting what's left. Targeting, you mentioned, Ann, at the very beginning, this CESAR report that came from the Scientific Technical Advisory Committee for the Bay Program, just looking forward into all the different ways we should be managing the Bay cleanup differently. And one of the big recommendations from that report is to target our resources to things that have the biggest impact, best bang for the buck. And so there's only so much money appropriated at the state and federal level to do these things. Water temperature needs to be a consideration in planning and siting and implementing restoration and conservation efforts. Nature-based features, things like living shorelines, some of the stream restoration projects you talk about. We heard this discussion about BMPs, right? Best management practices. There are some BMPs that cool the water down and others that heat it up. And that's never really been discussed very much. As a matter of fact, there's a 20-year period where we went from 50,000 acres to 250,000 acres of what are called heater BMPs, things like stream restoration projects that turned the central channel into a bunch of ponds. That does a really good job of removing sediment and phosphorus, but it does a really good job of heating up the water too, especially if all the big trees are removed in order to do it. So there's a way to do stream restoration where you can actually cool the water over time instead of heat it up. And we have to be really careful that our urge to reduce nutrients and sediment don't create warm water that makes that undoes the water quality benefit of that reduction. And then communication. We came back to this a long time, many times in the workshop, is the community's decision makers and scientists and practitioners need to talk more. A lot of times a practitioner will come with an idea to a local government. They have to meet their stormwater permit. And so they put a stream restoration or some other large pond onto the permitting agencies, and they didn't talk to a single person in the community outside the local government themselves. They've had big pushback in some of the projects that do remove trees, because trees have lots of other important benefits besides just cooling the water and water quality. And so more communication at the outset of coming up with a project idea to be able to see if the community already loves their trees for those other reasons. And then you can consider the thermal impacts of removing those trees and maybe come up with a different design. Between the watershed and the tidal, there were some kind of different large scale approaches. So we need to moderate temperatures in the watershed. We need to minimize heating. Just be very aware of how water gets heated up through impervious surfaces, through the reduction of tree cover and shade, and as Seth was mentioning, through the disconnection with groundwater sources. It's a very big thing. In the tidal areas especially, we need to adapt because there may not be much we can change. It's a big system that's affected by the entire ocean and whatever temperature the ocean is. And the different critters are going to arrange themselves into their preferred habitats. And there might not be much we can do about it like we can on the land. We're just going to have to adapt and then minimize impacts from other sources of stress for those same critters. So yeah, on the right, you can see that heater BMP statistic I mentioned. So starting, in 1985, we had hardly any of those. And now we have, actually, I got that wrong, 450,000 acres of heater BMPs. And so we're going to need to stop doing those and maybe take some of them out and put better BMPs in, things like infiltration, things like tree cover that are going to be able to keep that water cool. Accelerating conservation. I think people don't understand that those cold water refugia that Seth mentioned have to stay shaded. They have to stay with their groundwater inputs. And in a lot of cases, we can take two of those segments that are functioning and maybe have one thing in the middle that's not, like you saw that red dot, and do something to that red dot that's going to then connect those two segments and have more connectivity. And I think that approach is getting a lot of traction, this idea of delisting a stream from what's impairing it and doing it in these very small Huck 12 size watersheds where we can reconnect the landscape and those cold water refugia. Promote the cooler best management practices. The state and the local governments are pretty blind as to where the money's going in a lot of cases. They don't have a lot of, it's like if it takes out pounds of nitrogen, we love it. We don't care what else it does. And so we really need to take a look at temperature as another really important factor in the best management practices. And then good land use planning. Let's not lose it. Let's try to get back forests where we can regrow them, and let's reconnect where the groundwater is coming from. Adaptation. This is more in the bay, but also in these thermal refugia. Include connectivity and remove barriers to the suitable habitats. Just like I said before, this idea of delisting. We need to learn how to do that in the shallow tidal waters. I think there's very little that we do along those shorelines that's not just whatever the waterfront property owner wants to do. And so we really need to think about long stretches of shoreline. Where can we put money together and do a mile of living shorelines where we can reconnect the tidal, intertidal areas to where they were and cool down that intertidal zone so that it can be more resilient. And then lots and lots of recommendations on communication and outreach. I'm not going to read them to you, but stronger engagement with the landowners. Improved technical assistance, I think, is really important. A lot of times I've talked to the Department of Environment in Maryland, and again, they are more reactive to somebody and what they want to do to their shoreline than they are in providing technical assistance. So what's the best thing to do for their shoreline? And they have biologists on staff that know that and can do that, but it's not part of the regulatory process to intervene and maybe tell somebody the design they brought them is probably not a good idea for the type of shoreline that they're dealing with. And it doesn't stop at the shoreline itself. Basecaping, lawn conversions, those are things you can do to cool the water down on its way. Even if it's running off your driveway or sidewalk, on the way to the bay or on the way to any water, it can be cooled down, it can infiltrate and join the groundwater. I think we did hear also, working with local governments to improve land use planning. That means engaging at the very earliest. Most local governments do every 10 years a comprehensive plan where they're taking a look at all their growth potential, all of the developable land. That's the stage where you want to engage. Once somebody puts a permit in to do something, it's almost too late. And it's much more difficult to stop something that might be proposing to cut down 300 acres of trees if nobody engaged in the planning where that particular parcel is identified as a development area. So I know it's not the most exciting work, but sitting through a planning commission meeting and finding out what they're up to and how they're planning to muck about in your jurisdiction over the next 10 years and having an opinion about it is going to really matter. So we really depend on volunteers at the local level to do that. And then local governments are not aware of this in a lot of cases. They're very much concerned, as they should be, about reducing the nutrients, as we've been telling them to do for 30 years. And so they really haven't been thinking about stream temperatures. And so a lot of their BMPs have been the ones heating them up, especially in urban and suburban areas. And so we really need to have that overlay. And it'll be a difficult conversation because, like, again, they've planned their land use for 10 years and they planned their stormwater BMPs for 5. So having them, tear up their list and start over and take a look at temperature might be an unpopular thing for them to do. All right, running out. The last ones for specifically nearshore habitat. Common criteria and metrics to help target site and design natural infrastructure projects. There's really not any of that out there. We're really taking a look at the individual property owner. Might be 50 feet of shoreline, might be 100 feet if we're lucky. That's really not a way to manage a system that's dynamic with sediment going from one place to the other, depositing and eroding intertidal wetlands and things like that. We need to support research and investigate natural resource restoration strategies. We did that with oyster reefs, with the 10 tributaries across the bay. I think it was a great example of how we need to address seagrasses, marshes, all the other really important coastal features. Cooler BMPs everywhere, especially if you're really near a tidal water. So while the big bay signal, middle of the bay, you aren't going to see the signal from rising temperatures in the watershed, you are going to see it in tidal waters in a lot of our tidal creeks and rivers. And so we do need to think about cooler BMPs in those places. And then habitat changes are going to happen as the sea level rises. So we need to know that the marshes that are important to us now are going to be underwater, and the new marshes that are going to be important to us in the future are going to be somewhere a couple feet higher, which is now dry land. And most of the states in the watershed have not considered this and how it affects things like private property ownership along the waterfront, how it affects the sovereignty of the state. If the state owns everything below mean high water and the mean high water line changed and the state didn't go and resurvey it, then the waterfront property owner has to assume, well, they can go out and fill back to their old property line. And so we have a lot of these decisions being made kind of permit by permit and in a very reactionary way as people either perceive or observe erosion, and it's not being done in any comprehensive way. Lastly, these ecosystem-based management of fisheries is really important. Understanding more about how certain species can be okay up until they're not, because they're going to reach a threshold of either temperature, dissolved oxygen that is then toxic to them. And we need to understand that for each of the species, not just the ones that we catch, but the ones that they're eating. And then we also need to get more of this information out to fishermen. There's this idea of having advisories when the water temperature is too high. Don't go out straight bass fishing because it's a very stressful day for them. Other things are happening that are going to be increasing their mortality just because you're catching them on a hot day. A lot of these same communication things that you saw for the watershed are there for the tidal rivers, and I'm done. Sorry to go on.
All right. Yeah, I'll let you guys have the last word, but I'll just say there's a comment, and I think maybe this is the perfect thing to close with, that CO2 is a root cause of, right, of climate change and atmospheric warming. And what are we doing? Like, what is CBF doing, and what are we doing as individuals? And I wrote down a bunch of stuff real quick. I was like, well, we can all plant some more trees, like in our own yards, right? We can definitely plant them over top of our driveways so that they shade our driveways. We can put solar panels on our roofs, right? We can drive less. We can buy EVs when it's time to switch out our cars, because ultimately it's going to take all of us, I think, to have an impact. Seth, you got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, two things. One, you talked about fishing closures. We've seen that during these really low, dry, droughty conditions where local waters will be shut off from angling, or they'll put in hoot out restrictions like you hear about out west. A lot of times you can't fish after 2 p.m. in the afternoon or whatever because the water gets too warm. We deal with that, and I think that's the other thing climate change is going to do is the demand for water. We have these spring creeks in these farming communities in the valley that sustain trout populations that anglers fish for year round, but farmers also draw water off of them to irrigate. And when it's not raining, they're drawing water, and that's when we need the water in the creeks. And so it's the water quality. There's a water quantity piece to this as well that I think could play big for particularly towns, municipalities that draw their water from surface water, or their municipal water from surface water. And then the other piece from the carbon perspective, I think CBF and a lot of organizations are doing a lot, and there's a big new push. And Doug, you might have mentioned this too. But with carbon sequestration and soil health and regenerative ag, there's a lot of what soil is capable of doing from a carbon perspective. And so there's a big push in that from the federal and the state level through agency funding to do that. And so I know CBF has a big role in that as well. But there's a lot of potential there. You're muted, Doug.
Yeah, you got to unmute, Doug.
Sorry, didn't realize I did that. The more organic matter you have in the soil, the more water it can store, and the slower it'll infiltrate back into streams. So yeah, whether it be in the coastal tidal marshes, which they call blue carbon, or regenerative agriculture, yeah, we're doing lots of work in both of those areas, mostly for the mitigation of greenhouse gases to sequester the carbon underground, but they also have the adaptation piece where your more organic matter and more water storage is going to get you through the droughts and the floods that are part of the climate change picture.
Yep. All right. I think we have closed it as far as questions are concerned. I just want to say thank you so much, because boy, without you guys, I would not know what thermal refugia is. Right, and I had to add a couple of new words to my vocabulary. You guys have been great. Thank you very much. Really appreciate everything that you shared with us tonight. And yeah, thank you. Just thank you very much. Seth, looks like you got one more thing.
I was going to say one more piece. If anyone's interested in learning more about the science of brook trout and climate change, I encourage you to just Google search Than Hitt, THAN, first name, last name, HITT, USGS scientist. It'll go to the website for him, and he's got a list of his publications and studies he's done all through the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, looking at the impacts of climate change and modeling it on cold water ecosystems, mountain streams, warm water streams. He's done some stuff specific to the Potomac, looking at groundwater influence and shallow aquifer stuff. So it's really interesting things that I can't speak expertly about, but he's a smart guy for sure. So tap into him if you're interested in that kind of stuff.